Good morning, Shanny. Thanks
morning.
for joining us. So today we are going to discuss an important topic, heat waves, and then you see the impact of heat waves on the vulnerable groups.
Yes, and today's a good day to talk about that because we're outside. It's not even 10 o'clock in the morning and already it's 39 degrees. So I understand that especially for women, we're having an increasing number of days in the year where they're expected to work and it's over 40 degrees, which is quite a critical point. I mean, I think often in the past we've tended to look at the impacts of heat merely on productivity. But what we're seeing at ADB is that women in particular are very vulnerable to the impacts of heat stress. We can categorize it into three areas where women, and therefore children, are particularly vulnerable. Essentially, you can break it down into biological reasons, social reasons, and economic reasons. On the biological, just in terms of the physical makeup of women, their bodies are more vulnerable to heat stress, particularly women who are pregnant or breastfeeding. And then also hormonal fluctuations make them more vulnerable than men. On the social side, what we see is that women, because of their caregiving roles, especially in Tajikistan, they spend a lot of time looking after elders, children, vulnerable people, disabled people, and that work places them in the home. And many homes in Tajikistan, especially in rural areas, you don't have the infrastructure for cooling, fans, electricity, air conditioning, that sort of thing. And the caregiving role as well is centered around things that generate more heat, such as cooking, for example. So can you imagine on a day when it's 40 degrees, you don't have access to cooling, you're inside having to cook hot meals because of course most meals are cooked here, and you just don't have, your body doesn't have the chance to cool down even at night, right? And then on the economic, what we often see is that women are working increasingly in the agricultural sector as there's a high degree of male migration here. And then if women are working outdoors, often they're having to take their children with them to fields, and then there is no cooling, they're wearing traditional clothing which keeps them quite hot. They can't, like us, benefit from shade of trees because they're working in more open fields. There's lack of access to water to help them cool, to shade to help them cool, and also hygiene facilities as well, so they're actually reducing the amount of water that they drink. So all of these things have an impact on bodily health. We've even heard from women that we've talked to in the field that they're reducing they're cutting down the time that they're breastfeeding their children from the recommended 2 years to as little as 5 months, simply because of the fact that they need to take their children outside and work outside with them as well. So all of these things compound.
Yeah. At UNICEF also we continue to analyze the socioeconomic impact of the heat waves, especially on children and families with children. We also continue to find new ways of addressing this crisis. So I understand ADB is doing a lot on this issue, and your recent work on heat stress and gender. Can you tell us something more about that?
Yes, so we've actually launched a while ago a regional program. Actually, it's cross-regional. It's here in 2 or 3 other countries as well. And what we're really going to look at is developing culturally and geographically specific heat action planning. We're going to do this by involving women's groups, communities, NGOs, partners such as UNICEF, to really make sure that we're finding out what the specific impacts on women are, finding out where women are vulnerable, whether that's socioeconomically, whether that's geographically, whether that's to do with occupation groups, and then really helping them to work with us to devise specific heat action plans. So for example, in some countries we're doing cooling centres. So in the Tajikistan context, that might be agricultural cooling centres where you've got shade trees, where you've got access to misting, for example, to help women to take breaks to cool down, and with children that they're also taking to their workplace. It could be looking at innovations in the type of clothing that's culturally appropriate to wear when you're working in those sectors in the field. And this has been a hot topic in Tajikistan recently, of course. On the back of that, we're actually also launching an innovation challenge. So we're interested in everyone's ideas on what kind of things we can do to really address the heat stress that we're increasingly experiencing.
Heat waves, as we know, are becoming more frequent and severe due to climate change. Tajikistan has been experiencing a significant rise in temperatures over the past few decades. Particularly, the number of days with extreme heat has dramatically increased since 1960. UNICEF is deeply concerned about the impact of heat waves on children in Tajikistan. Recent data indicate that more than 70% of children in Tajikistan are exposed to heat stress. Every year, this number continues to rise. Children exposed to heat waves are prone to a multitude of health problems, ranging from heat stroke to diarrhea, low birth weight, and that puts them at greater risk of asthma, different allergies, and cardiovascular diseases. Involving women in the planning process is always critical for creating effective and sustainable solutions. As climate change continues to impact our lives, we need to work together and have a coordinated and inclusive approach to address this challenge. So very recently, UNICEF actually ran an information campaign to sensitize families with children about the heat wave and what are the impacts, and then how they can protect children, and also how the pregnant women especially can be protected from the impacts of the heat wave. The other thing that we are doing is working with Ministry of Health and Social Protection to strengthen the existing social protection system, so that how the program and the policies can be adapted and made shock responsive, so that we can protect poor and vulnerable through the social protection systems. I understand there are many innovative ideas and approaches being implemented around the world, and ADB is also doing a lot in terms of parametric insurance for heat waves. So why don't you tell us something more about that?
Yeah, so parametric insurance is something we're considering for Tajikistan, and we're piloting it now in other countries. Parametric insurance is different from normal insurance because instead of waiting for something to happen and then assessing the damage, so the impact on income or the impact on your crop or what have you, and having to get an assessor to come and determine and value, essentially it gets triggered by verifiable events, such as maybe it's like for 3 days in a row the temperature was above, let's say, 40 degrees, and then because of that someone could not work outside, or it impacted on whatever their business is. And so it enables, for example, for women and women who are managing children, that they can get smaller, more frequent, more predictable payouts, so they can continue to meet their expenditures for food, for their kids' education, for health needs, for example. And it's smaller but more frequent, more predictable, and the premiums, of course, are very, very low for that kind of insurance as well. So, for example, in other countries, we've collaborated with telephone companies who, instead of paying, let's say, 10 simonis for your phone bill for that week, you'd pay 11 simonis, so the difference is very small, but now you've got some insurance for this kind of thing. You know exactly when it would pay out and what the triggers would be, and you can even access it through that phone app, and that money can be added, for example, to your phone wallet. So these kind of things that are very simple, easy to use, small premiums, small payouts, but it's very predictable, and we can link it to things like heat.
Yeah, that's great to know, because when we design innovative approaches, there is always a challenge to see that how these approaches can be context specific and inclusive, so that we reach the people who are left behind. So what is your thoughts on this? At
ADB, we always make sure that that the programs that we support are not only very well targeted by really bringing local stakeholders such as Committee on Women, local leadership, NGOs, partners to help us design and really put them together, but also that they're going to be sustainable. So if you want something to be sustainable, it needs to really meet needs, and it needs to continue beyond the life of any project or any funding. And that means institutionalising it, not only with government institutions but also with communities themselves. So this is, I think we're singing from the same song sheet when it comes to these kind of approaches that are really geographically, culturally appropriate and specific, needed, and that people adopt as best practices as opposed to just doing it while a project's running, that kind of thing.
Indeed.
In Tajikistan, we're taking a comprehensive approach to gender-responsive heat action planning at the national level. We will explore collaboration with the Committee of Emergency Situations and Civil Defence to develop a plan that will guide actions during emergencies caused by extreme heat. This plan will include multi-sector coordination mechanisms and focus on enhancing gender-responsive information dissemination, ensuring that everyone, especially women, receives the right support when it's needed the most. We're also excited about potential demonstration projects such as cooling shelters for rural women, which we're considering based on consultations with the Ministry of Agriculture and local women farmers. Since 70% of Tajikistan's population lives in villages where agriculture is the main activity and women perform most of the field work, this initiative is crucial for protecting their health and productivity. Looking ahead, we're committed to expanding our partnership to broaden our reach and increase our impact. By working closely with organisations like UNICEF, we can align our efforts and amplify our impact across the region.
Involving women in creating sustainable solutions is always important. So as we move forward on this agenda, let's work together to create innovative approaches and influence policies and programs which can really reach to the people where we care of.
Yeah, basically all of our work here is always centred on a very comprehensive gender analysis. In the case of heat stress and extreme heat, what we'll be looking at doing is basing the design of our work on heat vulnerability analysis work and coming up with what we would call a heat resilience plan. And within that plan, it's not only going to say, well, what are the particular vulnerabilities of women, of children. It's going to be sector-specific, location-specific, but it's also going to talk about, well, who needs to be involved, what networks need to be created, how will this feed into or be responsive to early warning systems, which we were talking about before. What's the scope here for things like parametric insurance, which we already talked a bit about, and then look out on our social media and maybe on yours too for information about the innovation challenge of things that we can do that are new to address some of these problems. At the same time, we have to really realise that not all women, not all children will be impacted in the same way by heat. We know from experience elsewhere that heat stress can also lead to greater impacts, for example, on domestic violence. And so it could be that one of the responses might be not only cooling centres, but cooling centres that also act as places that people can go to access services and get help when they're experiencing other kinds of stresses as well. So we need to make sure we take a holistic approach that's sustainable, that's basically bolted onto robust community consultation, so that our approaches are really very inclusive and resilient.
Thank you. So as we wrap up this conversation, what would be your last key message for all of us?
Well, we need to really pay a lot of attention to climate change, to the growing impacts of heat on everything, and I suggest that we get out of the heat and get some cooling so it doesn't impact our health.
Yeah, let's beat the heat.
Yeah.